Hi there. Welcome to this initial conversation around PA 546, the program evaluation class at NC State University. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about introducing the concept of evaluation. This will just focus on the definitions, a little bit about the history, and some conversation about the evaluation typology or the way we classify evaluations. So with that, I'm going to jump in and start. Evaluation is just an assessment, right? It's making some sort of judgment about the amount, the number, or the value of something. And when we put it in the context of program evaluation, this is one of the first definitions and that really speaks to the fact that it's a profession that uses formal methodologies to provide useful empirical evidence about public entities such as programs, products, and performance in decision-making contexts that are inherently political and involve multiple, often conflicting stakeholders, where resources are seldom sufficient and where time pressures are salient. I think it's an interesting definition from the standpoint of it. It really begins to professionalize the program evaluation work. And formal methodologies are anything from survey research to focus groups to interviews to any sort of number of methodologies that create a body of evidence that really show whether or not a program, oftentimes it's programs, but this program evaluation can be used in the marketing of a product and in performance. And it's oftentimes done in decision-making context, particularly programs, government-related programs, in terms of allocating resources, which can, inherently make this a political decision in one way, shape, or form. I think the context of the stakeholders also plays into the political nature of the decisions that are made, right? And so, that's the other piece. There's always stakeholders, whether it's parents of a literacy program, whether it's people who are disabled participating in a particular program, any sort of stakeholders, whether it's the foundation that's supporting and funding the program or a government entity funding the program. All these stakeholders are at play here. Resources are seldom sufficient and time pressures are salient. Usually there's a time frame on when stakeholders want to know what's happening. And rarely are there really resources that are really dedicated to program evaluation out in the field. It's tough to convince, and particularly in the context of my own nonprofit world. Do you invest money in services or do you invest money in the evaluation of those services, right? And so sometimes making sure that people have a roof over their head and are fed and are clothed takes precedence over creating an evaluation. So those are sometimes issues that are at play here in program evaluation. The ultimate two categories that an evaluation looks at are both merit and worth. Merit is kind of the intrinsic value. Does it actually meet the need of those who it's intended to meet? And the flip side is it could be an external criteria, right? It could be that there is a standard for family resource centers at the national level, and does a program meet those standards, right? And a great example of internal merit or merit is that some sort of welfare or job-based program can help recipients of welfare actually get jobs and come off of welfare. Well, the worth of that is the extrinsic value, right? That's the value of the program outside of does it meet the needs. In fact, in the welfare example, ideally, if participants are getting a job, that will reduce the amount of welfare that's needed to support that individual family. And when you do that multiple times, it reduces the cost of welfare on the system. So those are two examples of kind of judging, the merits of the program. Does it meet what it intended to, and the worth of it? What is the external benefit? We used to, in the homeless world, we oftentimes talk about, is a person moved into housing, and that's the success, right? In terms of the worth of the program, we have to ask ourselves, is actually moving somebody into a permanent housing more cost effective than, say, they're being on the street, they're using the police department, they're using the emergency rooms, they're having societal costs that are actually way more expensive than the costs of a rental subsidy. So again, merit and worth are oftentimes the elements that are judged in a program evaluation. This is a slide, just a quick history. It started back in the 1800s when organizations were like looking at the quality of mental health institutions, and there was evaluation going on there. There's always been kind of evaluation in terms of how we measure children in school, right? A, B, C, D. That's an evaluation. But where we started seeing this at the program level is in the 60s, when we started the War on Poverty and the Great Society programs. And the first kind of legislation, that Elementary and Secondary Act, was actually required an evaluation plan that were reported to state agencies. And then subsequently, after that, you started seeing all federal programs being required to be evaluated. And then in the 70s, you started seeing a growing professionalization of the evaluators. You had two associations that merged into the American Evaluation Association in 85, but it was predominantly university professors, government evaluators, and education evaluators that made up the profession. Along came the 80s, along came Reagan, and what we saw were huge cuts to social programs across the country. And that also, people were concerned about, are these findings useful or not, right? So they were questioning the value of evaluation. They were cutting social programs. So what happened was that individual government bodies, HHS, CDC, FBI was even one on the list, that started creating their own internal evaluation units. And then along about the 90s, you started seeing this whole, wait a minute, we want some accountability still for what we're investing in. And that amounted to whether or not resources were allocated to these different programs. So also in the 90s, you started seeing foundations begin to create internal evaluation units. And so foundations also started saying, okay, we're making investments. How are these investments paying off? Are they working? What's the best use of our resources as we invest in the community? And, since then, in 2000, you've seen a growing kind of emphasis on things like participatory evaluation, developmental evaluation, the whole concept of collective impact, which is something I really believe in, and the whole way in which systems need to be evaluated. All those kinds of evaluations have emerged probably in the last 5 to 10 years. So you see this progression of evaluation in terms of history. So typology is just a way of classifying it, and the fun, this I use a lot of food in my videos, and you'll see that when I talk about logic models and cookies. But the Robert Stake was one of the first people to really differentiate two types of evaluation. And they were based on, was the recipe followed, and is it tasting okay, right? That early stages, that's a formative evaluation, right? So it's a process-oriented evaluation. You're tasting the food, you're saying, oh, I'm going to add some salt, right? You're not serving it yet, but when you serve it and the guests like it and the guests taste it, that's the outcome evaluation, right? So you've got this formative stage that's fairly early on in most projects. Are we doing what we said we were going to do? Is it working? Are we achieving the numbers that we said we were going to achieve in the program? And how effective is it? What's the change that you're experiencing? We'll talk more about that in the logic model. But Chen, who's the author of our textbook that we'll be using in the class that I'm teaching, he asked a couple of questions, right? And the first question is, well, what if the cook tastes the soup thinking, oh, I'm going to do this and taste it and fix it, but says, oh, I'm not going to serve this. This is not help. This is not good at all. Right. So there's this, whoa, this is process. It's early on in the process, but it's really kind of a conclusion that's made. Right. And then the flip side is, what if the cook serves the soup to the guests and the guests give the cook really good feedback to incorporate into the recipe? Maybe it was the addition of cilantro in the soup that gives it a little kick, right? So that too didn't fall into those nifty categories of formative versus outcome evaluations. So Chen kind of created a more a typology that builds on this notion of, there are both program stages, both the process piece and the outcomes piece. And then there's functions of the evaluation. Is it about constructing, continuing, or is it about making an end decision? And so he kind of simply put this in a 2x2 table where you can see the constructive process evaluation. That's the typical I'm tasting the soup to see if it's salty or needs a spice, and I'll add that before I serve it. And then there's the constructive outcome evaluation, right? So that's okay, we're at the end of the project, and or the soup has been tasted and the guests really like it, and they're like, oh, could we add some nuts to this or some sweet potatoes to the stock, right? So you're still constructing, but it's at that outcome space. The conclusive side, right? So this is the process. The conclusive process evaluation really is that, okay, I'm going to test this. I'm going to taste the soup, and I'm just like, nope, not serving it. Not okay. So there's a judgment made, and that's it, right? The conclusive outcome is that that's the traditional, the guests are fed the soup and the soup's really wonderful, right? So those are some of the simple typologies. We've reviewed the definition, given you a little bit of history. There's all sorts of great history out there. And then some of the introduction to the typologies that we'll be using in the program evaluation class here at NC State.